Hello and welcome to IGPP Expert Talks. I'm Heena Goswami, Editorial Consultant with IGPP, Institute for Governance, Policies and Politics, New Delhi. On November 5, 2024, the US citizens will elect their next president. The election in USA has raised considerable excitement among Indian audience as well, and hence IGPP has begun an educational series to introduce the audience to the various facets of the electoral procedure and reflect on the issues that are important to the American voters. The program would further reflect upon the consequences of the voters' choice on the larger world with particular focus on India and highlight the role played by Indian and other diaspora communities in the US election.
Today, we analyze the legal troubles of the two front-running candidates of the US presidential election and their families, as well as the political ramifications of the same. The political landscape in the US presents an unprecedented scenario. In the long history of the United States, while many presidents have had run-ins with the judiciary over policy issues, this is the first time that a former president who is still in running for the next presidency find himself in hot waters. Former President Donald Jr. Trump and the present Republican candidate is faced with 4 criminal cases. The first case relates to falsifying business records to cover up the hush money payment he made to an adult film actress. The trial for the case began in mid-April and ended on May 30th, 2024. The former president was convicted in the case and faces up to 4 years in jail. Trump also faces criminal charges in relation to January 6th Capitol riots and 2020 election, where he faces allegations that he pressured officials to reverse the results, knowingly spread lies about election fraud, and sought to exploit the Capitol riot on 6 January 2021 to delay the certification of Mr. Biden's victory and stay in power. In yet another case, Trump and some 18 other defendants are accused of criminally conspiring to overturn his very narrow defeat in the state of Georgia in the 2020 election. In the last case, Trump faces charges of mishandling classified documents by taking them from the White House to his Mar-a-Lago residence after he left office. It's also about whether he obstructed the FBI's efforts to retrieve the files as well as the criminal investigation into his handling of them. Except for his conviction in the hush money case, the trial is yet to begin in other criminal cases. Trump has also been embroiled in civil cases relating to, among other things, the business empire that made his name. With his conviction, Donald Trump has become the first former president to be convicted of a felony. This unprecedented scenario has brought forth many questions. First, as a former president, is he immune from prosecution? While a conviction does not bar him from running for office, there are questions as to whether he could attempt to end the federal prosecutions or pardon himself for any federal crimes if he regains the presidency. There are also speculations as to what would even happen if he is jailed but still wins the presidency. In an interesting turn of events, President Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, was also convicted recently on all 3 federal felony gun charges he faced, concluding that he violated laws meant to prevent drug addicts from owning firearms. The conviction marks the first time a president's immediate family members has been found guilty of a crime during their father's term in office, though his crime predates Joe Biden's tenure as president. Hunter Biden faces up to 25 years in prison, though as a first-time offender, he would not get anywhere near the maximum, and there is no guarantee the judge would send him to prison. In our ongoing series about the US presidential elections, to understand the legal troubles of the two front-running candidates and their families, as well as the legal and the political ramifications of the same, today we are joined by Professor Jared K. Carter. Professor Carter is a veteran attorney and advocate for social, legal, and economic justice.
A faculty at the Vermont Law and Graduate School, he's also an active member of the Vermont Bar and directs the Vermont Community Law Center. Welcome to IGPP Expert Talk, sir.
Great. Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
So the former US President, Donald J. Trump, has been convicted in what has been labeled as the hush money case. Can you please shed a little light on what this case is and what are the other legal troubles that the former president finds himself in?
Well, this is one of several cases, criminal cases, that the former president is charged in. And it's the first one to move through the process of actually having a jury hear the evidence and decide whether or not he is guilty of the crime. And they convicted him essentially, and it's a little bit of a nuanced legal theory, but essentially for covering up the way money was spent to essentially get his mistress not to go public, to get the news media not to cover the story. And he used his business in order to facilitate that. And it got a lot of coverage here, obviously, in the United States and across the world, because it's the first time in the history of the United States that a president or former president has been convicted of a crime. We're now awaiting the sentencing phase, which will be essentially the judge deciding what the sentence will be. And it could be anything from, a sort of slap on the wrist probation to jail time, and I think we'll see. Obviously, there's all sorts of complications that come with either of those approaches, but it's really pretty historic here in this country to have something like this happen. Interestingly, and I'll leave it here to continue the conversation, but interestingly, in the 24 hours after former President Trump was convicted, he raised tens of millions of dollars from his supporters. So clearly, to his most ardent supporters, this is a badge of honor. It's not a conviction. It's the opposite, which in my mind is a very, very troubling sign when it comes to the rule of law and democracy in the United States.
As you mentioned, this is sort of historic because he's the first former president to be convicted. But have there been other former presidents or presidents running who had like sort of run-ins with the judiciary, or they might or might not have been convicted?
Well, there's definitely been presidents historically who have had run-ins with the judiciary. I don't believe there's ever been any who have been charged with a crime. Others have, critiqued, to put it mildly, the judiciary. There's a famous story of a former president threatening to pack the court, in other words, add justices if they didn't decide a certain way in the New Deal era. So it's certainly not the first time that a president has critiqued the judiciary, but it is, to my mind, the first time that a president's been charged and charged in multiple jurisdictions, right? This hush money case was a state case. There's the federal cases, the special counsel and the documents case. There's the case in Georgia, and we can talk about all these in more detail. But to my mind, this is the first, and I think that's what makes it historic. And what makes it troubling, not only the fact that he's been convicted, right? You have to get a conviction. It's a high bar, right? It's got to be beyond a reasonable doubt, and it's got to be unanimous on the jury. So it's not easy to get a conviction. And the fact that they convicted him as quickly as they did, I think, shows the power of the jury system, but also I think undermines this narrative that this is the deep state that Trump uses to sort of downplay that this is a judiciary run amok, it's the deep state. That might work with some of his most ardent supporters, but I think most people see 12 jurors who were selected through a very demanding process found him guilty of this offense. And so I think it's historic, and it's troubling in so many ways.
Because this is sort of an unprecedented situation, we believe that there are no rules that would stop him for running for presidency, even if he's convicted. Mm-hmm. But would it in popular opinion or imagination, would his conviction affect his presidential candidature? And while it seems that his ardent supporters see it as a badge of honor, is this sentiment also felt by the majority of people, or how are American citizens feeling about the prospect of a convicted felon as their future president?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, you correctly pointed out being convicted of a crime. In fact, even if he was put in jail, would not prevent him from running or even becoming president. The U.S. Constitution is pretty limited on the requirements. Essentially, you have to be over a certain age, 35, and you have to be born in the United States. You have to be a born citizen in the United States. Outside of that, there's not really any other requirements. So legally speaking, this has absolutely no impact on his ability to run or ultimately become president. All you got to do, and I say all you got to do, it's a big task, but you have to win 270 electoral college votes based on the state apportionment to become president. His ardent supporters, I think they love this, right? They love this, plays it into their political worldview that there's this deep state, there's this judiciary of elitist judges on the East Coast and the West Coast who are run amok, and they see this through that lens. And Donald Trump has said this. I think he said at one point he could, in broad daylight, shoot someone in downtown Manhattan and people would still vote for him. And you know what? As disturbing as that is, as horrific as that is, if that's indeed true, and he said that, I think that's a reflection on just how polarized and the situation is here in the United States. I don't think that, and I think some of the most recent polling bears this out, I don't think that in those swing states, because in the U.S. electoral system, right, where it's not about the popular vote. Usually the popular vote and the electoral college line up, but in the United States presidential election, there's delegates and the candidates are trying to collect delegates. And the magic number they need to get to is 270 delegates in order to win the presidency, right? Electoral college votes. And so what ends up happening as a result of this sort of bizarre system that we have to elect the president is that a couple of states become the swing states, the states where if one of the candidates wins these three states, they win the election. They get over that 270 electoral college votes. And so we're talking about a very few number of states. And I think within those states, my reading of the polling data, within those states, it's very close, but that with many of the swing voters, sort of the more moderate Republicans, independents, those people that are undecided, by and large, they are going to be turned off by these convictions. And so I think the popular perception, and this has been wrong in the past. I mean, President Trump won in 2016, even though all the polling and all the pundits said no chance. He won. So, who knows? But I think the popular perspective right now is that these convictions, these trials might help him raise a lot of money from his base, but they hurt him when it comes to that very small sliver of voters, right? They talk about suburban moms as sort of the classic example, right? They don't want a president who's been convicted of a crime. And there's other sort of swing vote folks in these states as well. But within that narrow band of people who can really turn an election when it's this close, I think most people think that this is bad for former President Trump's chances.
So on one hand, there are conspiracies of deep state, which Trump supporters say that, the deep state is trying to implicate Trump into these legal troubles. But also, like majority of American citizens, as you point out, would not be as comfortable with a convicted felon. But now that Hunter Biden has also been convicted, does that complicate the picture from both sides? Like, on one hand, it might falsify the deep state conspiracy theories, but on another hand, would they like another president whose son is a habitual drug user and gun rules violator?
Mhm. It's a really interesting situation, and I think also unprecedented in a lot of ways. My feeling is that based on the fact that Hunter Biden was convicted, well, a couple of things. I think it's nonsense, and this is pure political rhetoric on the part of former President Trump to say this is some sort of these trials are some sort of deep state conspiracy. These are state judges, state courts, juries, and federal. So it's not just one government apparatus, right? In the United States, we have a federalist system of government, right? The states are, for the purposes of policing their laws, independent of the federal government. Washington, D.C. has absolutely no power over New York state courts or Georgia state courts. So that's number one. Number two, I think the problem now for former President Trump is it becomes, at least with sort of those moderate American voters, it becomes a lot harder for him to convince them that the system is quote unquote rigged, because a Democratic president's son was also convicted of a crime. Again, I think for his most ardent supporters, they don't care, right? They're not even thinking about that in that term. But I think for many, for the sort of those swing voters, the fact that Hunter Biden was convicted is evidence of the fact that the system works. It's not based on politics. It's not based on whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, or you're connected to the Bidens or the Trumps or the Clintons or the Obamas. It's based on the rule of law and that everybody is subject to it, no matter how powerful. That's my view. I think those swing voters in those swing states probably tend to view it along those lines. But for Trump's most ardent supporters, they view his convictions as rigged and Hunter Biden is a crook. I think politically, the other thing here is I think the Hunter Biden conviction is less damaging to Joe Biden because the narrative, I think, that's played out most, even though, yes, in some corners of the MAGA Trump space, there's this laptop and all these conspiracy theories around Hunter Biden. I think how most people view this with respect to President Trump is, look, Hunter Biden had a really hard life, right? And he has admitted that he used illicit drugs. We've all seen it. And so I think there's this feeling of empathy. He went to rehab. He's trying to get his life back on track. I think for most people, there's this feeling of empathy of both Hunter Biden, his family, and Joe Biden have gone through some really difficult times. Hunter losing his mother, his brother, all of these other issues. I think there's a sense of empathy and sort of everybody has someone in their family and maybe themselves have gone through hard times. Whereas when it comes to Trump's convictions, I think for most people, they view those as the aura that Donald Trump has always had, from his time as a reality TV host to a business developer in New York City, has always been sort of this, I push the rules, I break the rules. That's my whole MO. And so I don't think there's any surprise that he ultimately that caught up with him. So I just think it's a different dynamic in terms of how it's going to play out politically. But that's just my sense.
In the structure of the US government, it is the president who appoints the Supreme Court judges. And since there's a conservative majority in the Supreme Court, can the former President Trump take the cases again to the Supreme Court and get some relief against the conviction? I understand that there's a pending appeal on whether a former president can be prosecuted in the manner of normal citizens or not. And if that were to happen, wouldn't it subvert the rule of law notion?
I mean, absolutely. Yes, there is a case, and folks expect it to be decided any time as to whether or not former presidents have immunity for certain acts that they carried out while in office. And I think, to my mind, the answer is yes. If the conclusion is that a former president cannot be convicted of crimes, even if they committed them during their time in office, then the rule of law is really has been hurt very, very much. Right? The whole idea about the rule of law, and it's not something that's written down, it's not an actual rule, it's a concept that says that the rules of the road apply to everybody, that there's no special treatment. I mean, that's fundamental to the rule of law. And so I think if the president is able on some technicality to convince the Supreme Court that he was carrying out his official duties when he did what he did in Georgia or in Florida or with the records or any of these places, then I think the popular perception of how the judiciary works will be harmed very much. I think the Supreme Court, in particular the Chief Justice Roberts, is very aware and concerned about the public perception of the Supreme Court. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think we're going to find this blanket immunity that Trump is really asking for. But we'll see. There's no question the judiciary is under attack by Trump, and that many members of society have come to the conclusion based on those attacks, the judiciary is corrupt and rigged and all of those buzzwords. I think if the society writ large ultimately concludes that the judiciary is corrupt, then we have a real problem, because the Supreme Court has no ability to enforce any of its decisions, right? The Supreme Court doesn't have an army or police that it can send out and say, well, we desegregated the public schools with this constitutional holding, and you have to abide by it, otherwise we're going to send out some enforcement mechanism. They don't have it. The only way that the decisions of the Supreme Court are enforced is because the public and the political leaders across the country all sort of agree, even if we disagree with what the Supreme Court says, we are going to abide by it. Once that stops, then all bets are off. And so that's, I think, my biggest concern when it comes to these attacks on the judiciary. Look, I think the U.S. Supreme Court gets lots of cases wrong. Okay. But I recognize that when they reach those decisions, that is the law of the land. Doesn't mean I, as a lawyer, don't advocate against them, try to get the law changed, use the courts to try to get the laws changed. But the law of the Supreme Court is the law of the land. And once people stop believing that, then I think all bets are off, because it has no mechanism to enforce its decisions. It relies on sort of the good faith of the people and the government and the politicians and the leaders in the states across the country to go along with that, even if they disagree.
This one thing about the American judiciary that is very peculiar to us, that judges in the US judicial system are allowed to, and I believe allowed to have and profess their own political opinion. Mm-hmm. But won't it compromise their integrity, as it can make them subservient to their ideologies?
Yeah, so interestingly, a couple of things, and this applies to Supreme Court justices and judges and anybody that works in public service for the government. The First Amendment, freedom of speech, still protects their ability to have political views. And personally, I think that's okay. I think the idea that simply because someone becomes a judge and puts on the judge's robe, that they no longer they're not human beings with beliefs and ideas and thoughts is obviously not reality. Most of the time, you don't see judges or justices out there engaging in politics. Right now, we have a couple of justices who are being, I think, rightfully so, critiqued, Justice Alito and Justice Thomas. Justice Alito, there's some controversy, perhaps you and your viewers have seen, about flags being flown upside down. And I think that reflects very poorly on the court. I would, as a First Amendment advocate and scholar, would say, well, you know what? The First Amendment protects even the right of Justice Alito, and apparently his wife was involved in some way. If they want to fly the flag upside down because that's their view, that's their right. I think it reflects very poorly on the court and calls into question the integrity of the court, and that's bad. But they do have a First Amendment right to express their views. The ethics rules that apply to the Supreme Court are pretty minimal, and they're not enforced by they're enforced by the court to the extent there are any, right? Each justice decides for themselves, do I need to recuse myself from a particular case? And the logic there is, if Congress were to pass laws that said a justice has to do this or a justice has to do that, then Congress, which is the political branch, would have some influence over the justices' decisions because they wouldn't want to be reprimanded in some way. And so in order to keep the judiciary independent of politics, the rules that apply to them aren't rules of law. They're internal policy rules and individual decisions. So that's why you don't see Supreme Court justices recusing themselves all that often. And the theory there is the independence of the judiciary is more important than, perhaps questions around whether Justice Thomas took a vacation with, some, big Republican donor. And I think there's arguments on both sides of that coin, no question about it. But the theory, anyway, as to why Supreme Court justices get life appointments, why all judges in the federal bench get lifetime appointments, why their salaries aren't allowed to be cut by Congress, is because, and why the rules that apply, at least to the U.S. Supreme Court, their ethics, the justices' ethics rules, aren't enforced by Congress, is this idea of separation of powers, and that you wouldn't want political whims of Congress to influence what Supreme Court justices, or judges for that matter, do. But absolutely, all members of the judiciary have their political views, and it's no secret when a Republican president appoints justices or judges, most of them are going to be of their legal and political bent, and Democrats the same way. But the idea, of course, is that once somebody becomes a judge, that they put those things aside and they rule based on the law and the facts before them.
You have in part answered my next question, but I would still ask it in case you want to add a little more to it. So there was this recent controversy over Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas accepting gifts from a billionaire friend who had the same political inclinations that the judge seemed to favor when deciding upon a case. How do you view this controversy, and do you think these are clear attempts at undermining the independence of the American judiciary?
I mean, I view them as evidence of the fact that the Supreme Court, and this is going to have to come from the court itself, most likely, but the Supreme Court has got to have more effective ethical rules, right? Look, Justice Thomas, just like every other human being, or hopefully every other human being, has friends and people that he wants to be with and travel with. And so there's nothing wrong on the surface with any of that. The problem is when those things aren't disclosed, or when Justice Thomas is hearing cases that have some impact or tangential impact on that individual, or interest that individual has, that becomes a real problem. So I think the Supreme Court needs better transparency rules that are actually enforceable by the court itself. Because what ends up happening is exactly this. The public becomes less trusting of the court. They say, well, all these folks are corrupt. The clerics, as we call them, are corrupt. And we can't trust what they do as a result. And that's bad for the rule of law. So I think the Supreme Court needs better transparency rules, ethical rules. I don't personally think Congress is the place to make that happen, although I can understand the argument. And again, I think the downside there is if Congress starts to get involved in regulating the courts, then that independent judiciary is also going to be harmed. So it's a tough balance, but clearly we've got to have better rules around recusal, around ethics, around accepting gifts, so that this sort of thing doesn't happen in the future.
Thank you so much for joining us today and giving